Some of you asked whether the herding dog from the last video would ever be playable. So when the Unity Asset Store came back around to sponsor another video, and thank you for that, by the way, the timing was just too good to ignore. Hi and welcome. Over the course of this video, I'll show you how I put the game together, what I learned, and what tools I used along the way. You can get it over on itch.io to play it too. Link is in the pinned comment. I enjoy creating these types of videos a lot. I get to show how I approach a project and share some parts I learned, enjoyed or, well, cursed about, while spotlighting some genuinely great assets from my toolbox. They help me throw together a prototype quickly to know whether an idea works as well as I thought it might. They flesh out the ones that survived that initial burst of motivation, and they fill in the parts of my skill set that just aren't there, like my non-existing modeling skills in Blender or understanding the magic of creating shaders. So, where did I leave off? Arthur the sheep herding dog found a lost lamb, which works well enough for a topic for a tiny game, I think. Tiny, since my focus was on a topic I knew I wanted to get better in, but lacked the proper kick in the butt to tackle it. Creating an open world. Now, I have no plan on creating a vast open world to explore, but maybe I can manage a small valley, just enough space to keep the edges and corners looking distinct and interesting, but also flesh them out enough to be worth exploring. I threw together a very rough map of what I wanted to create, and off to Unity I go. I started with something I've seen a few times before in other tutorials and devlogs, having an area to explore mechanics in first. Seeing as I set myself a deadline of just 3 days, I needed to stick to a rather strict timeline. Figure out the idea and mechanics first. Implement the mechanics. Build the rough landscape and test for feel and potential pitfalls when it comes to movesets and goals. Add elements to the landscape and test for performance. Then see where I can add some polish while not falling into picture book levels of frames per second. That's a lot to do in the time frame, so I kept the mechanics themselves simple. I had a script that would check for sheep, and if Arthur's, that's the dog, was close enough, they would be counted as found. Another mechanic was sniffing for sheep, which would display a bar showing how close or far Arthur's was from the nearest sheep. Balancing this system with the gameplay of having the player actively look for the sheep themselves was a bit tricky. Hiding the sheep in the landscape felt a bit like writing elaborate quest text, while handing the player the closeness bar was essentially like placing fast travel points for the quest objectives. I'm not sure if I managed to balance it well in the finished project, so I'd like to hear from you. You can find the link to the game in the pinned comment. Just keep in mind that it's been created in what was essentially a personal game jam setting, focusing on learning and experimentation instead of polish. Sniffing also spawned hoofprints into the scenery, which lead into the direction of the hidden sheep. Again, I wondered if I was making it too easy and obvious, but hey, dogs have great noses, so why not? Figuring out placement was the first time I tinkered with something new, since the spawned hoofprints had a major issue. I was testing in a flat area, while I planned to work with the terrain for the actual game. So instead of a quad, I checked out decals. I used them in my Tracksanity game before to add decals to a car, but remembered struggling with displaying it only on the car alone, not on the asphalt below. Turns out, I should have taken the time to look that up back when I worked on the game. It really isn't that hard. You'll have to enable rendering layers for decals in your settings, then tell the decal renderer to only render to that specific layer, and enable that layer in the list of rendering layer masks on the object that should use and display the decals as well. I tend to expect solutions to problems to be so much harder than they turn out to be on the regular. I trusted Malber's animal controller with the general moveset of the dog, which is his Sky Border Collie by the way, as I doubt I'll ever make a better working one, even outside the given time constraints, and figuring out how to create a character controller for a quadruped wasn't the focus of my project anyway. Pick your battles with care while under a deadline. The sheep and other farm animals you'll see in the game are coming from the 6 games excellent Toon Farm pack. While there is a slight mismatch in style, they are well made, come with a great set of animations and varieties, and are close enough in visual appearance that they don't stick out like sore thumbs all over the place. In the end, adorableness trumps countable polygons here. The core mechanics were in, and I started working on the scenery. My drawn map really was just a rough idea of where I wanted to take this. Essentially, I wanted to have an outer edge running around this small valley, a waterfall, and some neat verticality. My first issue was the default size of a Unity terrain. It is way too big to handle for my project. But I didn't really have an idea of what size would be adequate. Looking over my notes again and not wanting to spend too much time finding a perfect solution, I instead added a timer to my scene, hit play, and just walked diagonally over the map for 5 minutes. It's something I learned while working as a teacher. If I do a task and it takes me a few minutes, students will typically take at least double the amount of time, up to about 4 times as long, plus those who will not be able to finish the task at all. That's a rule of thumb to structure tasks in a classroom around, so why not just use that as my measuring stick here as well? With 5 minutes, I would probably end up with about a 15 to 20-minute game, at least for the task of finding a path to the furthest corner of the map due to environment layout. Searching for sheep along the way would add to that time frame, but I had no way to estimate how long that would add on top. If you've seen some of my recent videos, you'll have seen my toolset for creating landscapes already. Instead of the built-in terrain system, I'm working with the Microverse core collection. It is a non-destructive way of creating landscapes, which means that where in the basic terrain system you'll stamp a height map and then have to deal with the results, with Microverse you'll use height maps as placeable objects. That way you can later change their rotation, location, sizes and everything else, even remove them again if the result doesn't match what you are going for. The height maps I'm using come from multiple of Roland's excellent stamp packs. I love the detail and how well they can be mixed and matched. There's a free pack you can check out to test them, and if you like what you see, I recommend his full pack of stamps. My drawn map's general layout did not survive this first pass of creation, but the important parts were the biomes anyway, not the actual place they would end up in. After adding height maps comes the part for the general ground textures, and this stuff just won't stop making me cringe and think my work sucks while doing, no matter how often I go through it. If it is the same for you, keep in mind that you're typically in a bird's eye perspective, far away from what your player will see, and you will most likely add scenery objects and environments on top of these bare textures. Think of this step as the primer to your painting, just the general display of intention, what you think those areas will be colored like at a later point. Guidelines, if you so will. Instead of painting textures directly, I'm using the Textures tab of Microverse, and use Roland's Microverse presets. They are pre-made objects to place into the world, which are set up in a way to focus on one specific area. Textures, vegetations, or whole biomes, which is essentially both combined and put together in a neat pack. To make these work, I have BK's mountain, meadow, and swamp biomes assets pack in my project. The presets are generally bridges between Microverse and the environments. They are amazing helpers to quickly fill an area with a specific type of vegetation or textures, and are awesome to create the general scenery to find at any given place, before switching to tools to detail special areas of interest by hand. But before I added vegetation, I needed something else I had been procrastinating on: paths. And again, I had to learn that they are much simpler to work with than I had expected. They are implemented in Microverse and work with Unity's spline system. And if you have seen previous videos of mine, you might already have noticed I always mention splines to be neat, because they are, and you should use them if you don't already. What I especially like is that they overlay the area with a texture setup for the paths without me needing to paint it in by hand. I'm sure this could look neater, but again, I learned something new, and that was the goal of the project. Fine-tuning can come in later projects, or when I have just some time to tinker and explore. This is also where I started to add water to the scene, which is something I learned to appreciate while working on my game Down the Mountain. No matter how open you want your space to be, creating an interesting scenery to walk through and explore takes a lot of time. To cut down on this time, consider adding lakes. Lakes are pretty, but can be any kind of size and don't require their area to be filled with plants or other vegetation. They can fill a lot of space too, which means you can have a dense forest area and vast-feeling lake areas, which is a nice contrast and change of scenery. Having a lake also gives you more time to put into the vegetation denser areas around the lake. In the end, it can shift around the time you spend on any given area of your landscape, but if you're in a hurry, at a lake. The water I'm using here is Staggered Creations Stylized Water 3, which is hands down the nicest water I have in my hoard of assets. It is ridiculously pretty. Have a look at these rainbow-colored refractions. Gah! So looking forward to using this one more. Once I had these basics in, it was time to check if my mechanics worked with what I had built. So, onwards to entering play mode, and I need to remember to fill this hole. The dog slides here. Maybe I need to change the slope a bit. This is way too steep. Maybe I should add some stairs here, and whoa, this won't pass inspection. Better remember to add some railing here, and as somebody smart once said, your head is for having ideas, not storing them. If you find something you'll have to remember later, don't trust your brain to help you here. Write it down. For a long time, I did that by having a blank sheet of paper in front of my keyboard, but taking notes and keeping track of where in the scene they apply to has always been a bit of a hassle. On one of my recent trips through the asset store, I came across an asset I had no idea if it would be a good fit for me, but it sure looked interesting enough to stick in my head. As my dog slid down yet another unintended slope, that asset once again popped up from my memories. Scene Notes by Ciro Continisio. An asset that makes it possible to add notes directly inside the scene. I tapped out of my project, opened the asset store page, checked out the short but very well made overview video, and pressed buy, telling myself this totally wasn't a spontaneous purchase, but really one I had considered for weeks. Yeah. I typically only show off assets in these videos I've been working with for at least a few weeks or even months to get an idea of if I'd feel comfortable recommending them, but for once, you actually get to see my first steps with one. The only look inside the documentation I needed was to add it to the overlays of my scene. Everything else was rather self-explanatory, and it was easy to see how to customize it even further. I did another run around my scene, this time adding scene notes wherever I went, sometimes adding them to any of the two categories, but mostly not even bothering with that at this stage. It's not in the audio track of this video, but yeah, there was an audible groan when I stopped play mode and all the notes were gone. However, they are created scriptable objects, and there was a small button here that said refresh, so one click later, all the notes were back. This is an absolute no-brainer of an asset to include in your toolbox. It's a great little helper and made me go back to his asset store listings once more at a later point. Creating the environment works just how I have shown it before in other videos, really. Mapping out the different biomes I had in mind: main lake, smaller side lake, a swampy area, leafy trees in the valley, and evergreens in the higher areas. How I did this isn't any different to how I tackled it in previous projects, and in case you want to see more about that, have a look at my walkthrough for that particular topic. Just one point I want to highlight. For rocky and mountainous areas, you won't believe how many rocks you'll add to the scene to make it look somewhat believable. When I started out, I applied a texture to the height map and the slopes for rocks and mountains, but it always reminded me of melted ice cream and good, but old RPGs. The good old times of counting repeating patterns on open world RPGs. At this point, I'll add my mountains enclosed by hand. If you want to tackle this, get very well acquainted with your placement system. Sure, you can do it by hand and changing the values in the transform over and over and over again, but I like to work with scatter by distant lands a whole lot more. It quickly lets me resize, angle, rotate, and place objects, cutting down on manual adjustment time by a lot. Still, throwing all these rocks around my world did take a bit over an hour. Don't be afraid to rotate them to odd angles, use them upside down or more. BK's environments come with a shader that always places moss on the flat tops of the shapes, which really helps in having not everything look the same all across the world. I still think I could do a better job, but this is good enough for now. Another round of testing later, I had the general environment down and first rounds of performance checks came back. Yeah, not surprised really. I threw in a bunch of assets. Honestly, I was rather surprised it didn't turn out worse. This is where the tutorials I watched around the profiler really came in handy, and a bunch of graphical settings later, I managed to score much better values. Just to make sure I get a bit of breathing room, I also reduced the denseness of many of the presets. There really wasn't any reason to have any given point of the map to be covered in 5 different kinds of grass. It also had the added benefit that the hoof prints were easier to see again, too. But this was only a milestone to check off before the remaining work was to be done. The final round of adding stuff saw the addition of some man-made objects like houses, fishing piers, fields and such. The objects come from the Poly Universal Pack I keep recommending because it is really neat. This is also where another asset by Zero came into play and how I even found his scene nodes assets in the first place. Black Box 2. It's a marvelous helper to keep you from accidentally making changes to a prefab and cleans up the hierarchy a good deal, since it hides child objects from coming up in the list of scenery objects. There had been a version 1 before, but version 2 just released at a discount and I picked it up out of sheer curiosity. It's going to go into many more projects going forward, I can tell you that. He also has some more useful helpers, even free ones, like this nifty Quick Enter Play Mode button. You probably already know you can toggle off reloads in the settings to start into play mode faster, but by adding this button, you don't have to constantly switch your settings by hand every time you want to either enter quickly or enter with a required reload. Really neat, check that one out. For objects that needed to be let out, like crops on a field or railings near a cliff, I used Staggered Creations Spline Spawner again. It just works so well with terrains, really. The final pass was the setting of the game itself. This location pretty much reads like nondescript late spring to early summer, given that the trees are dressed in saturated greens and the flowers are in full bloom. However, I wanted to enhance the feeling of summer a bit more, but I was lacking ideas of how to do that. Until I left my PC, and I recommend doing that from time to time, for a while to have a walk through a nearby forest. What was I missing that I could implement to give it a bit more of a summery feel? 3 things, really. Sounds, lights, and stuff floating in the air. Lights were the easiest. I angled the sun up higher in the sky and added a nice looking skybox from the all sky set, since during summer shadows are somewhat short. Sounds weren't terribly hard either. While I don't live in a region with cicadas, we do have a lot of small little bugs making noises as well. It's also the sound of ruffled grass, wind through leaves, and bird calls. I've been using Master Audio 2024 a lot these months, and setting up soundscapes was done with a few lines of code. And lastly, the one that had me eyeing the performance meter like a hawk, floaty particles. I tend to work with a VFX graph instead of good old Shuriken, because the way it is structured works better with my brain, while the way it scales up and down works better with my eyes. Seriously, why are the particle components not scaling with the rest of the UI? Finally, I added the sheep, enjoying that I had left notes for myself about potential hiding spots, polished up the UI a bit more, hit build, and I uploaded it to itch.io. This was super fun to work through and experiment with, and I think I managed to get better at a few areas I wanted to improve in. Did you enjoy this walkthrough? Let me know and please give it a like and consider subscribing. Thank you for watching. Have a great week!